Hey YouTubers, welcome to my watercolor pet portrait painting class. In this class I'm going to go through the entire painting step by step, showing you how I paint a watercolor pet portrait. This is a quick painting. I would say it's for intermediate. Beginners can do it as well. Don't be afraid of it, give it a try. There in the description you will find a link to download all the reference images, a sketch outline, material list, everything you need to paint this picture, except for the materials themselves. Of course, you're going to have to do that on your own. Please click the subscribe, like, and comment buttons. Well, don't click the comment button, make a comment. Tell me what you think of the video. Tell me what you would like to see. Is there something you want me to paint? Is there something that you don't like about this video? I'm kind of doing this as a new format, so your feedback is greatly appreciated. But enough about all that, let's get painting. The first thing I like to do when I'm starting a painting like this is draw myself a roadmap, a sketch, I guess, but I call it a roadmap because it's telling me where the dark values are, where the light values are, what areas I want to avoid putting down my initial wash, which is usually a lot of water and a lot of paint, kind of gets everywhere. And in this area here, for example, I'm going to draw like a closed circle. That to me tells me that this is an area that I want to avoid when I'm putting down my initial wash. And the areas where you can see I've kind of shaded in with the pencil, those are the dark areas that I want to have. And it's just a guide. And you'll see as I put down the initial wash why this is so important. I accidentally picked up my dagger brush and started mixing my initial wash with it. And I thought, oh, I'll just go with it. But it didn't turn out to be the best idea. I'm going to do the initial wash with a mixture of raw sienna and quinacridone magenta and a lot of water. I mix up a ton of paint so that I have enough to cover the entire background. I'm going to put a little test sample on here, see if I can get it accurate. You can see here this dagger brush just doesn't carry enough pigmented water to cover it the way I want it to. It's great for flicking out hairs and things like that, or little fine lines and whatnot, but for this it's just not working. Here I've got my trusty quill brush that carries a lot of water and a lot of pigment. So I'm trying to cover the entire painting in my initial wash, keep that wet enough so that I can add in the darker values and it bleeds well into the paint. Being careful to avoid the areas that I don't want to paint on. I would normally, or not normally, I guess sometimes I'll paint over the entire painting if the initial wash is light enough. But what's important to note here is that some of the areas beside the lighter areas are very dark shadow areas that I want to put in while this initial wash is still wet. If I were to paint over the whole thing, there'd be no way to keep that from spreading into those light areas. With my initial wash still wet, I'm going to mix together a mixture of Van Dyke Brown and Burnt Sienna for these shadow areas here. You can see how dark this value is. It's going to dry a bit lighter and I'm going to have to add a few layers to it to get it very dark. But if you look at the reference picture, you'll notice it's also really dark. I'm adding more Burnt Sienna here as I go lower down in the chest. You can see in the reference picture it gets more of a reddish color and less of a shadow color. I'm being careful not to go into the light areas that I left. For the lighter areas, I'm going to add some raw umber into the mix. I'm going to dilute the bottom area here down with a lot of water just to sort of like end off or trail off the painting that way. The goal at this stage of the painting is to paint in the different values, the lights and darks. And again, you'll notice that I'm leaving these white areas without any paint. I'll come back and I'll pull the pigment from the surrounding areas later. Often when I put in this shadow area, I'll come back with some clean water and just go along the edge to dilute it, just so that it kind of goes gradually into the rest of the painting. While I wait for the other areas to dry that I've just painted, I'm going to move over here and start working on the ear. Again, just adding in the values as I'm trying to match them to the reference picture. And I tend to pay more attention to the value, like how light or dark an area is versus how accurate the color is. That's much more important. For example, if I were to replace all the raw umber with phthalo blue, as long as the values are correct, this dog would still look like this dog. Now you'll notice here I'm leaving an area in the middle here that is actually a dark value area, like where the shadow is on the ear, and that's because I don't want that shadow to bleed into the wet paint. And now I'm adding some clean water into this area here just to lighten up the value. That actually does is push the pigments out of that area. Now I'll take that paint that I just picked up and move it down to this area here. And now I continue to work my way around the painting, just adding in the shadow areas and the midtone areas. I'm switching up the color a little bit, adding a little bit more raw umber here, a little bit more Van Dyke brown there, depending on where I'm at in the painting. And where things get tricky is keeping the areas, soft edges that you want to have and the hard edges that you want to have. So here, like this area, kind of is not as strong of a contrast between the light and the dark area. So I'm trying to make sure that I've got the right value, that I have enough water, that I'm not leaving hard edges where I don't want them. Now I've added some indigo into my Van Dyke brown to get a really dark value here, and I'm using a much smaller brush to be more careful as to where I put it. I'm going to come along with a clean brush with some water on it just to pull those edges out so that those are not hard edges. I want them to be soft edges. Now things get real crazy and we pull in some quinacridone magenta into the mix here to bring out some of those reddish values. It looks pretty heavy at first, but we're going to dilute it down. The correct way to say that would be reddish hues. The value again is the light or dark area. The hue is the color. I always try to be aware and make sure that I'm using the right terminology. For me personally, it doesn't matter. I call them lights, darks, colors, whatever. But again, I'm teaching a class, so I try to make sure I'm using the right terminology, which is why I correct myself. Moving over into the jowl area, we want to be careful because we have a lot of light areas right next to dark areas. So you'll notice that I'm kind of leaving some spaces in here because the dark shadow area underneath is still wet, and it will look good. You know, some areas can bleed in and some can, fade out. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but you do want those areas to be defined. Now I've let the paint dry, and I'm taking a wet brush now, and I'm pulling in some of the pigment out of the dried paint into the areas that I left white. Once the areas are sufficiently wet, I'm going to grab some extra pigment and just bring up the values a little bit. This is a great technique for making subtle highlights in areas. If you look at the reference picture, you'll notice it's very gradual. It's still in a shadow area, the whole undertone area, but in that little highlight now it's starting to blend in more and more and more. Now I'm gonna take some of the existing paint on my palette. I've got some Van Dyke Brown, Burnt Sienna, Raw Umber, and I'm gonna start and paint in some of the shadow areas. Then I'm gonna dilute my brush with some clean water just to soften down the edges so that it blends in better. Now we're going to address some of these areas that I had left dry before. I'm going to start mixing up some lighter pigments diluted with lots of water and try to blend them in as well as possible, similar to what we did below on the highlights below. You'll notice that I'm doing a lot of pushing against the paper. And what I'm doing is I'm kind of breaking that edge of the pigment. It's important that you should use a synthetic brush if you're going to do it this way, because if you're using a real hair brush, you're going to wreck the hairs. This is a technique that I use often. So what I'm doing again here is I'm breaking those pigments and pushing them back. To do this, I've got wet water on my brush. I'm going to clean it off and dab it off with a paper towel. And then once it's dry, you're going to see here what I'm going to do is I'm going to roll my brush. So I'm basically using it to mop up the pigment. I'm kind of rolling it along and getting that pigment out. So this is a great technique for putting sort of like, think of it like an overlapping part. So if you look at the jowl, it hangs over top of that shadow area of the neck, right? So it really creates that little ridge or edge where those two light and dark areas come together. And now it's time to really bring up that value in here. It's quite dark. You can see in the reference picture how much darker it is, and we still have a ways to go. So while this area is a bit wet in here, we're going to start bringing in some of these darker pigments and spread them around. I've just got straight up raw umber here. You could also use yellow ochre. You don't need to buy raw umber. You can use yellow ochre. There's several colors that come like this. It's essentially different names for a very similar earth pigment. If you wanted to make the color or hue match more, you could add in some more burnt sienna. It'll make it a bit more of that reddish color. And speaking of that reddish color, we're going to grab some of our quinacridone magenta, mix it in with the raw ochre, or raw umber, sorry, or yellow ochre, whatever you're using, and just bringing up the value again in the ears here. Just being careful to not bleed those colors in together too much. Although I think it might be interesting if they did bleed a little bit more, it would make it loose. But you know, at this stage of the game, I wasn't ready to experiment that much. So I'm just adding in some water here to make that a bit more gradual. I don't want that hard line in there. So now I've added some Van Dyke Brown into the mix just to darken that up a bit. You'll notice here how like the paint almost looks like it's being scraped on. That's because there's not a lot of water on the brush. It's a lot of pigment. So I'm trying to get that as dark as possible so that I can put in some water, bleed it out, and use it to spread it around. Now I'm going to continue to use a mixture of water and pigment here on the ear to put the shadows where I think they should be, get the values correct. Here I'm taking a light wash of raw umber, and I'm going to fill in this lighter area on the ear that I left blank. I left it blank because of the shadows on each side. I wanted those to be established first. You can pull the pigment in from those shadows as well as darken up the value of the wash that you're putting on. Now we're going to get started on painting the nose. To do this, we're going to mix up some quinacridone magenta and some phthalo blue to make that purpley red color. You'll notice here I've got a blue on the right side and a magenta color on the left side on my palette. And so what I'm going to do with that is add in this light magenta wash over the entire nose, and then I can come back while it's still wet and put in some of the darker values. This will of course just be the base layer, and we will darken this up more as we go along. While I've got some of this light wash on my brush, I'm just going to put some of that very faint magenta value that's around the edge of the mouth. And now, as promised, we're going to add in some of the more purple and blue color into the nose area. And we'll soften up these edges with a little bit of clean water. We'll continue doing that to complete the first wash on the nose. We're going to use the same two colors in that light area underneath the eye on both sides. Now we're going to grab some of the more reddish mixture by mixing up some of the colors on our palette, which we have here was burnt sienna and raw umber, probably a little bit of Van Dyke brown in there as well, just so you can see it's all smushed around on the palette, but that's fine. That keeps the colors consistent. You'll notice here I seem to be hesitating a little bit, and that's, I'm just looking at the reference picture, seeing where those shadows are and seeing where the light areas are. And again, I've left the light areas open so that I can bleed them in later, like we did on the other areas. Now this next area is it's a little bit tricky, because if we look closely at the reference picture, you're going to notice these darker shadow areas and very subtle differences in value around there. Like there's the inside of the mouth, and then outside of that we've got a really dark area and it kind of folds around. And then on the other side, we've got the ear sticking out from the back. So what I'm doing here is I've got some Van Dyke brown, a brush that I can control, like a small accurate brush, and I'm going around and I'm using the dark areas, like the shadow is what I'm painting in, to establish where everything is. And that shadow will extend like right underneath, along the jowl, up the neck, and all around. Then I'll put some little markings on where those sort of dots are, like the whisker dots are, that kind of circle up and around, and fill it in. Then we're going to add in a lot more dark values and really darken this up, and this is where the painting's really going to start to come together. Here I'm just putting in some clean water, pushing up against those edges to soften the hard edges. Now, similarly to what we did earlier, we're going to fill in some of these light areas that we left blank because we didn't want the paint to bleed into them. And by now our nose is dry enough that we can take some straight up indigo, a very dark color. You could also mix phthalo blue, Van Dyke brown, anything to get a nice solid rich dark color. That's as neutral as possible. I like using indigo for dark areas. Once you pile it up enough, it looks almost black. I should probably use a finer brush here for that little part of the bottom of the nostril area there to fill that in, but I had the brush I did, so. We're now going to use a watered down version of the same color to put in some of these dark areas here on the nose. A little clean water to soften the edges. And now we're going to add the darker values, doing our best to keep the edges soft where they need to be soft and hard where they need to be hard. Now back to a heavy concentration of indigo, we're going to paint in the oval area of the pupil. I would normally leave a little white area where I want that specular highlight, the little shiny part of the eyeball. But because this is on a small 8x10 piece of paper, there's not a lot of room and it's just too finicky and it's really not worth it. So what I'll do at the end is use a gel pen to put that in. Once I'm done this, I'm going to use a very fine brush and almost draw in the areas around the eye just so that I know where everything is. I can bleed it out later and soften the edges later. Now we're going to go back to our burnt sienna and raw umber mixture, mostly burnt sienna here, and define some of these areas around the ear. I've just added some Van Dyke brown into that mix while it's still wet, just to get that edge nice and crisp. Our painting's really coming along nicely. We're going to take some quinacridone, magenta, and raw umber with a lot of water and put a light wash here on some of the more reddish colors. We can look at the reference picture and see that our painting is very light and the reference photo is much darker value in this area. After that, we're going to add in some of the shadow areas and some of the finer details around the face before moving on to the inside of the eye. I'm using a mix of hard and soft edges here. Where I want the edges soft, I'm diluting them with water after I put the paint down. I'm using the colors I have on my palette to make the orange area of the eye. So to start with, I've got some cadmium yellow hue, and to get the reddish color, I'm using a quinacridone sienna. You could use orange. If you have orange, you could use yellow and red. Any color to make an orangish color is fine. I'm going to start on the left eye, and then I'll move over and do the same thing on the right eye. Essentially, I'm just filling this in. If the painting was larger, I would probably make more of a gradation. And you'll also notice that my color is more yellow than the orange in the dog in the painting. You could add more burnt quinacridone sienna or orange or red or whatever you like to get the color more accurate. For me, I was just going for the value and didn't worry too much about it. Now we're going to finish off our painting by adding in the harder lines, the things that define the painting that really sort of sharpen it up a bit. That includes some of the shadow areas, some of these lines around the eyes. And when that's all finished, we're going to add a dot for the specular highlight or the shiny bit on the eyeball with a gel pen. And that will conclude our painting. I hope you liked this video. This is sort of a new format and something that I'm trying. I'd love to hear what you think. I'd love to know what you think about how the video is done, of course, how you like the painting. And if you could please subscribe or comment or like or do all those interactive things that help the videos along, that would help me out a lot, and I will then continue to make more.